So this book is a story of a biography of a woman who engaged in civil rights movements after the movement died down, after the marches, and the story of those women and men who labored in the boardrooms, in the classrooms, to make things better, to fulfill the promise of desegregation, to fulfill the promise of the Civil Rights Act and other measures. The title of my book, Bertha Maxwell-Roddey, A Modern-Day Race Woman and the Power of Black Leadership, I want to revisit and revise the title Race Woman, or the phrase race woman. It was used in the turn of the century to kind of symbolize activists of that time who really did everything to benefit and better the race, right? So as we move on through history, we moved on to the term activist to define these people. But I wanted to use the word race woman to define activists who really you may not see them on the front lines marching, but they are engaged in everyday activism to better the race. So they are race women and men. And Dr. Roddey epitomized through her civic and professional life, all that definition of a race woman. With that, so what does that race woman mean? How would I say that about Dr. Maxwell-Roddey? So she grew up in Seneca, South Carolina, a small town in the Piedmont region of South Carolina. And she did not grow up in an upper middle class lifestyle. She really grew up in a segregated South and raised by her grandmother. She graduates from Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte, and she becomes a teacher in the segregated schools right in 1954, right, with the Brown decision. She uses her ability to be mentored by great African-American women's principals to develop her own leadership style. And eventually, after becoming the first Black person to get a master's degree in educational administration at UNC Charlotte, she progresses on becoming school principal at segregated elementary school. And it's a history book, but it's really, I tried to infuse some of the humor from Dr. Maxwell-Roddey. She talks about that she was just sitting on a bench one day, and she starts talking to this older gentleman, and she's just talking to him, and like she would just talk to anybody. And he asked her all these questions about desegregation, and she says that she answered them honestly what she thought. And then later on, someone said, that was the dean of the College of Education. And so she actually becomes friends with these people who are core nucleus leaders eventually of the desegregation process in Charlotte. And so they put her on a track to be in administration. She also, throughout her story, I call her a reluctant leader, but very much when she assumes this role as a very strong leader. And so they have her take the position of a principal at a segregated school right in the middle of the busing crisis, desegregation crisis in Charlotte. And she goes to try to protect her students who are going to be bused after her school is closed. That's another discussion in my book. I look at the ambiguities of school desegregation and how it is a benefit in some ways, but also a detriment with so many Black school closings and Black teachers and principals losing their jobs. So she wanted to protect her faculty and staff, protect her students as she moved to a new school. And so she goes to the principal, and one of the principals was not supportive, and she went and called the superintendent of school and said, "You better get him in check. So she just had this ability to talk to leaders. And because of her authenticity, I say she has a pragmatic likability, very likable person, but yet tell you exactly what you need to be doing. Over the years, the book talks about the struggles and challenges African-American arts institutions face in urban cities, dealing with things like inadequate and equitable arts funding, dealing with things like class issues within the African-American community. Who do they try to attract to bring into the museum? What's their service role? Dr. Maxwell-Roddey wanted the service role to be children in the neighborhoods and things, but over the years that was done. But over the years, it also became a safe space, a kind of center for African-American middle-class life, as we have the reverse migration of African-Americans moving from the North and Midwest and the West to the urban South, to the new South Charlotte, to work in these new corporate jobs and things that they were being able to get. The center became a place of where they could congregate and have a safe space and learn about things and learn about art. And so that balance of what addressed those needs is also reflected in this story. And so it has an urban history and arts and African-American arts angle to it. And it's been an interesting experience doing an oral history of someone and with that stature and yet has opened up her life to share her life with me. I definitely have learned from that experience. And I've learned leadership models when engaging in my own administrative world at the university. So I'm very excited about this book. I'm excited about it because it also really shares what happens after the marches. And we have many books, great books on the civil rights movement, but this book tells us what happens when you've gotten the grants, when you've gotten the legislation. How do you make it work? How do you do that? And women like Dr. Roddey were the ones that made it work. Dr. Roddey was often a first Black woman, first Black person. And that story is told. We call it contribution is history, but we don't go further than just the announcement to say, what does it mean to be a first? How do you open a door? How do you keep the door open? And Dr. Roddey was one of those people who worked hard keeping the door open by designing policies and creating institutions to help sustain and keep that door open. And that was the work of the activism in later years, building institutions, creating policies. And it also talks about the ambiguities of the civil rights movement. How do you get these things to actually work? How do you think make a student's experience at a predominantly white college be supportive of them as an African-American student? How do they get on the football team? How do you get to be cheerleaders? There's day-to-day things, the nuts and bolts of civil rights activism. It also talks about that. And it also talks about women's leadership and how these women, like Dr. Maxwell-Roddey, were very adamant and authentic in their leadership, but they didn't cancel people out. And one thing she did in her Africana Studies program is she would put people who were adverse to that on her board that she could convince them, because she convinced them, she would have them, right? And so she didn't dismiss people or disregard people just because of their status or their opinion. She tried to convince them. And if she couldn't, she'd work around them, move around sometimes. So having the ability to know when to negotiate, when to seek allies, and when to move on was an ability she was adept at having. This book relates to the modern civil rights movement and issues we're facing today in untold ways, so many ways. First, as a model of leadership, Dr. Roddey, as I mentioned before, Maxwell-Roddey, did not cancel people out, but she also told people exactly what they need to be doing. She was authentic in what her directives, but she also listen to people and try to negotiate with them and understand where they were coming from and get on a common ground if possible. She also grounded all her arguments or proposals in evidence and data. And so it's hard to contradict her because she had the data and the evidence. That's one thing we can learn today from her through leadership. Also in leadership, as I mentioned before, to have allies and welcome support from people who are positive and would like to support you. They do not have to be of your same race, of your same gender. They don't necessarily be of your same political party, but they need to be in support of you and your cause. Also, she's an adept at embracing people as they are and seeing who they really are, and not, oh, that's the title of someone or that's the person down there. She saw them as people who could help. And for instance, when she was a graduate student at UNC Greensboro, she had recently married, had her toddler, been married for a while, but she had her baby toddler with her, and no one would let her stay because they didn't let children stay in the dorms. And so she stayed with a housekeeper, and that woman helped facilitate her getting her degree. Yet she also later on would have dinner with President Carter. She could embrace everybody as a person, not just a title. That's something we might need to learn today in helping us engage in our activism. Everybody can support us and really looking to see how they can do that. The other thing this book embraces is specifically looking at the role of Africana studies. When she began her journey with the then Black studies, no one knew what it was. She had to study it herself. She had to go into self-study and study with some of the early practitioners. The story of people like Dr. Maxwell-Roddey, who were there creating and developing the structures of Africana studies, enmeshed later on with the theorists to bring in the theory, really shows the early activism of Africana studies as a activism-based program where students were to engage in the community, not just learn things and not just read papers in conferences, but you learn how to get get this information out to the public. That was one of Maxwell-Roddey's goals, was to get the goals of information of African American studies out into the public, to the K-12 schools. This book is a pat on the back to them and the service they did, and to expand our definition of activism to look at those people, the everyday activists, the modern day race women and men in our society, and also to give a support to the allies who engage in supporting them, advocating for them, speaking up for them, using their privilege to support the betterment of African Americans. So in a lot of ways, I think it's relevant. And it's also, I tried to show some of the likability of Dr. Roddey. And if you ever had the chance to meet her, she's just a very personable, likable person who is determined. And before you know it, you'll end up doing what she wants, even though and enjoy doing it. You didn't think so at first. So it's been a great experience working with her.